Hello and welcome back to CIS 1440, JavaScript Programming for the Web. This week is week 3. We will cover objects, functions, and events. Primarily we will focus on the Murach Chapter 3 book, but there's also the Duckett book as well. Its Chapter 3 has a lot of information about objects and functions, etc. So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to review a little bit about methods. So last chapter we discussed the window object, which is the global object in JavaScript, and it has the prompt and alert methods that we already covered. There's also the confirm method. This method confirms an action. So basically it displays a dialog box that contains the string in the parameter, an OK button, and a cancel button. If the user clicks OK, the value true is returned, but if the user clicks cancel, false is returned. Additionally, these are two methods working for working with numbers. You've got parse int and parse float. So parse int will take a string and it converts the string that's passed in to an integer data type and returns that value. If it cannot perform the conversion, it will return the special value NaN, which is not a number. Same thing for float. Float will return a real number, decimal data type, returns that value. If it can't convert it, it returns not a number. Here are some examples. So you have confirm. Are you sure you want to delete it? If they hit OK, it will return true, and then you can use statements to deal with that. Otherwise, it will return false. You can gather input, so you can prompt the user, enter any value, and then have a default value here. So if you call parse int, it'll be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it truncates the extra data. Entry B does a similar thing down here. It'll truncate the data. You've got 3 new methods that we want to deal with that are part of the document object. Now the document object, it is not the global object, so you have to actually specify document dot and then one of these methods. For example, get element by ID. This gets the HTML element that has been specified with this particular ID that's passed as an argument, and it returns that element. Write and write line are very similar. They write the string that's passed to it into the document. Write line writes the string and then advances to a new line. So you can see the examples there. Write and write line work approximately the same way. We'll assume that today is a date object, and then we're calling toDate string on it. We're going to deal with text boxes as well. So a lot of times you have the text boxes directly on forms or on the web page, and you want to deal with those rather than having a bunch of prompts constantly pop up, alerts and prompts and confirm boxes and all this other stuff. Focus moves the cursor into the text box but doesn't return anything. The two properties that we want to look at that are part of text box object are value and disabled. Value is a string that represents the contents of the text box, and disabled is a Boolean, which means that it has a true or false value, that controls whether the text box is disabled or not. One method that we're going to deal with that's part of the number object is toFixed, and then you pass the number of digits. So this actually returns a string representation of the number after it's been rounded to the number of decimal places in the parameters. So here's some examples of how to get a string value from a text box. So if we have two input boxes here, say for example input type equals text, that defines it as a text box, this attribute right here, type, then double quotes you have text. ID defines the identification designation of this particular text box. Same thing on the next one. This is also a text box, and it has the ID sales_amount. Later on, without chaining, now chaining is a special technique. It's called object chaining or just chaining. you can do this, do things in one statement without spreading it across multiple lines. We'll see that example right down here in a second, but without chaining it looks like this. First, we use first name. We create a variable named first name, and that gets document.getElementById first name. So it actually returns from the document object model the first name text box. So at this point, this is a text box. On the next line, we're redefining first name. Since Java is weakly typed, that means we can redefine it to mean something else. So we're actually taking the text, it's a text box on this side, so we say text box first name dot value. That returns a string. That string is stored then again into this variable, so now this variable contains string data. So later on you can use it for whatever purpose you want. We could use two separate variables here, but it's not necessary. Or it's not necessarily the best way to do it. So you could say var first name equals document.getElementById. Then you pass it first name, and then you chain it, because this whole thing returns the actual text box, and then you can just say dot value. Later on, how do we get a number value from a text box? Well, what we said before was that the text boxes have they return strings when you get their values, right? So the data inside of a text box is a string. Without chaining, we're first setting sales amount equal to document.getElementById sales amount. So that right there is a text box. So sales amount is a text box at this point. Then we're redefining sales amount to be a string because we're taking the text box sales amount dot value and then returning the value. And by that point, then this by the next line will actually be a string sales amount. Then we're redefining it one more time. So we're reusing it, right? Reuse, reduce, reuse, recycle. Well, we're recycling the name over and over again. Sales amount equals parse float of sales amount. Now you might think that looks kind of squirrely, just like this does. But by this point, this sales amount on this side is actually the string. We parse the float and return the decimal value, number value, and that gets put into this variable, which we're reusing. And by this point, after this line, sales amount is then a real number. With chaining, you can do this all in one line. You can say var sales amount equals parse float, and if you'll notice very carefully, the parenthesis is on this side matches with the one on this side. All right, so you were calling parse float, so ultimately this value is going to be a real number. Now let's look at what's passed to it as a parameter. This whole thing is its parameter. Well, what is it? Document.getElementById sales amount is a text box, but then we chain that and say dot value, so that whole thing returns a string. So a string is passed to parse float, and then parse float parses the string if possible, and then returns the value to sales amount. Otherwise, it returns not a number. Other examples of chaining. You could say sales amount equals parse float, and then once the parse float is done, you can call .toFixed. There's all kinds of chaining you can do. At some point, it might become less readable, so you might want to reconsider doing tons and tons of chaining because it might get just ridiculous, especially without comments. So you want to include ample comments. Terms you should be familiar with are window object, right? That is our global object. It is the global object. Document object model, not a number, and chaining. Next, let's look at the syntax for creating an object in Java. So some of this has been kind of review. We've been going over stuff that we've at least seen some examples of previously when we dealt with the is valid, and we talked about different ways to create different variables and such. But now we're going to look at creating an object. In JavaScript, anything that isn't basically one of the primitive types, you know, the number, string, or Boolean, we have to create it with the new keyword. So the syntax for creating a JavaScript object is to say the variable name var today equals new date. So date object, for example, new date. This creates a date object in memory and then returns the reference to today. Here are some of the methods of the date object. So the date object has toDate string, so that returns a string with the formatted date. Then you've got get full year, which returns the 4-digit year from the date. Get date returns the day of the month. And get month returns a number representing the month. Now you have to be careful here because January is 0, February is 1, March is 2, etc., etc. And December, the last month in the year, is actually 11. So it is numbered from 0, so you have to be very careful with that. Examples that use a date object, you can say var today equals new date. Then it says alert today to date string, get full year, get date and get month. This will print out, or rather put an alert that will show each of these values. Okay, so we've got the date object. String objects are also very, very useful. This string object has one property that we're going to look at called length. That tells you how many characters are in the string. For example, if the string is just in double quotes, it says John, John, then the length will be 4. It's the number of characters in the string. Index of, you pass it these 2 values here. It searches for the first occurrence of the string starting at the position specified, or 0 if the position is omitted. So you could actually just put index of and then the search term without putting a comma and specifying the position. In that case, it'll start at 0. But if you want to start somewhere later in the string, you want to provide a position. Substring, or substr, substr, has a start and then a length. It returns the substring that starts at the specified position, counting from 0, and contains the specified number of characters. Then you have these 2 gems right here. The first one, to lowercase, not surprisingly, returns a new string with the letters converted to lowercase. And then the other one returns a new string with the letters converted to uppercase. You have to be very careful with these too, because a lot of people use it and they just assume that it modifies the string they're calling it on. So for example, this one right here, when I say name.toUppercase, that actually does not modify name. It takes name, which is Ray Harris right here, and it converts it to all uppercase. So it's going to be capital R, capital A, capital Y, space, capital H, capital A, capital R, etc. And it will store that in name upper. Name length equals name.length. That gets the name's length. So it's 10 because 1, 2, 3. The space counts as a character also. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's 10 characters in here. To upper and to lower, do not have an effect on the specific characters that are already upper, lowercase, respectively. So for example, when we call to upper on here, it doesn't modify the R, it just keeps it the same. But the ones that are lowercase, it causes them to be uppercase. Additionally, if I had symbols in here, like numbers, or if I had an @ symbol, or special symbols, or semicolons, or whatever I want in the double quotes, it does not modify those either. It only modifies alphabetic letters. Var index equals name.index of. You'll notice index of searches for the first space. The space is at index 3. Let's see if that makes sense. R, A, Y, that's 0, 1, 2, and then the space is at index 3. So that's correct. Then, for first name, we just want to store the actual first name from Ray Harris. So we just want to store Ray. So basically you say name.substring, 0, comma, and then up to the location, or actually the length in this case, which just happens to be the index. So it's 1, 2, 3. Just happens to work in this case. So that'll store Ray. Here's the code for a web page. Right? You have an email form, you have labels and text, email address, join list, etc. You have to know that what a browser does in its memory is that it creates a document object model. This contains nodes that represent all of the HTML elements and attributes for the page. This is illustrated by the HTML page that we just saw, given this diagram. So these circular things are the element nodes, and then you have text nodes that might be inside of these element nodes. For example, title has a text node, H1 has a text node, label, etc. Here's the syntax for changing a text node. So with JavaScript, one of the major things you can do with it is dynamically modifying or changing the text node. So I can say element object.firstChild.node value. Now that might seem kind of confusing, but just remember, we'll see this more fully illustrated later on. First node.node value represents the value of the text for an HTML element. So if we have the element object, for example, get element by ID, email address error, and then we say .firstChild.node value, we're saying that we want to change the value of the text for that element. So this email address error, we're going to actually set the value by accessing first node value to the entry is required. Syntax for anonymous functions. Functions are blocks of statements that can receive parameters and return a value by issuing a return statement. They don't have to have a return statement, but they can. Those are called value returning functions, whereas if they just perform some things, like right here, these don't have a return statement. They set a date and then show an alert. Those are just regular void, what we would call void functions in a lot of languages, whereas if it has a return statement, it's called a value returning function. Anonymous functions, you actually they're kind of like delegates in C#, if you're familiar with C#, or function pointers in some other languages like C++. It's very simple to use, though. You say var show year equals function, and then you fill in the body of the function. So then later, when you actually want to call it or use the function, you can use it more than once. You just use the name of the variable with the parentheses and any parameters that are required. Even if it doesn't require any parameters, you still have to put the parentheses. The anonymous function $, with one parameter returns a DOM element. This is actually a shortcut that is used frequently by a lot of developers. If you put var $ equals function ID and then you return, so this is a value returning function, document.getElementById and pass it the ID. Instead of having to write out document.getElementById every time, you can use this simple JavaScript anonymous function here to call this indirectly. So when you want to actually call it, you just say $, and then pass it what you want, .value. That's a lot shorter than writing document.getElementId every time you want to use it. An anonymous function with two parameters that returns a value. Here's an example. This is anonymous because you have the variable name equals, then the keyword function, and then in the parentheses you'll notice there are two parameters now. To add more parameters than just one or none, you have to use a comma. So you put a comma there. So you've got subtotal and tax rate. You can say var tax equals subtotal times tax rate. And then you say tax equals parse float, or reusing tax here, getting the float value of the tax.toFix, that string right there. We're fixing it to 2 decimal points, and then we're returning the tax. So to actually call this function, they set the tax rate and the subtotal, then get the sales tax, calculate the tax, and then alert it, so they actually show it. So it's pretty straightforward. What about named functions? If you want to, one of the benefits of having a named function is that you can call it from anywhere in the JavaScript, whereas an anonymous function, you have to actually define it before you use it. But with these, with the named function, you can just put it anywhere, and it doesn't have to be before you call it. But in this case, you have the keyword function, then the function identifier or function name, and then the parameters. So it's very similar to an anonymous function, but you don't use the var keyword anywhere, and you don't have a separate variable. So here's the example. You have function show year. They do the same thing that was going on with the anonymous, and then you call it the exact same way you would an anonymous function. What about a name function with two parameters? Pretty much the exact same thing here. You just have function, keyword, then the name, and then you pass it two parameters, do the calculations, and then call it. So the terms that you should be familiar with are function, what it means to call or invoke a function, parameter. Now argument I didn't really go over clearly. In the book, they typically just say parameter all the time, but really when you define the function, like here, you have subtotal and tax rate. Again, these names actually do not have to match the names down here when you call it. This could be S and T, but this does make sense, so they just give them the same names. When you define the function, they're called parameters. When you call the function, they're actually called arguments. This subtotal 85 is actually fills in the value of subtotal over here, and 0.05 fills in the tax rate right there. So that's what an argument is. Remember, parameter is when you define the function, and then argument is when you call the function. A return statement actually replaces the value or replaces the function call, like here, since this has a return statement of tax, whatever it calculates the tax to be, it returns that value, and then that replaces its call here with that value. Ultimately, once it's completed, and then sales tax will pick up that value. It's not pointing to a function at that point. It just contains the value that was returned. Anonymous function and name functions, we saw these. Anonymous functions are when you have the var keyword, such as var f equals function, and then you fill in the body. Named functions you can call from anywhere, and you just say function name, parentheses with the parameters, and then the body. So they're very similar. Here's a function that uses a local variable named tax. So similar to exactly what we did earlier, we have var tax equals subtotal times tax rate, you fix it, and then return the value. Now, what about a global variable? Well, global variables are available to any function in the entire file. So this uses a global variable. So you have var tax outside of the function. You set the values. There's no need for a return statement at this point. And then later you just refer to that global variable. Now, that might seem like a good idea, but you could inadvertently use this variable tax. If tax is global, like here, this is called inadvertently because I didn't put a var keyword here. Now, even though you don't see var tax outside here, if you forget to use the var keyword the first time that you use a variable inside of a function, it will automatically be global. And that's what we call inadvertently global, or it inadvertently uses a global variable. So that could cause some unexpected problems. You could modify that value without meaning to. You want to use local variables whenever possible. It may seem convenient to use global variables, but they're actually kind of a bad idea because you can, if you create a global variable of any sort, either with the var keyword outside of all functions, or if you forget the var keyword inside of a function, it creates a global variable. If you do that, then that can cause some very serious side effects. All of the different functions, not just the one you want to modify it, have access to the variable and could potentially modify it. Other code could modify it too that you may not expect. So use local variables whenever possible. Always use the var keyword to declare a new variable before the variable is referred to by other statements. So here are the terms you should know. Scope. The scope refers to the where a variable is valid. Okay, so wherever the variable is valid, that is called the scope of the variable. Scope is in a programming language refers to the visibility of variables and functions. So we would say that a local variable has local scope. So if you declare the tax variable like we did earlier with the var keyword inside of a function, I cannot access this outside. So if I put an alert statement later and say, tax is tax, this has no access to what's in here because this is local, it's private, it's inside of the function body. So that's the scope of that variable. Global variable and global scope, any function inside the entire JavaScript file can access it. Global variables are those that either are declared with the keyword var outside of all functions, so they're not in the body of any function, or you might accidentally declare a global variable by just forgetting to put the var keyword inside of the function when you declare the variable. If you just use it and say tax equals or something equals, then you're going to have potentially a problem. Here are common events. We want to get into event handling when we're dealing with JavaScript. JavaScript applications commonly respond to user actions, like clicking on a button. These actions, such as the click, are called events. And the anonymous functions that handle the events are called event handlers. This is similar if you've had Java to event listeners. These are the event listener methods. To make that happen, you have to attach the functions to the events. In some languages, they refer to this as event wiring. So, for example, when the window loads, you're going to use that a lot because that's automatically called as soon as a page is loaded. We're going to use that to do things like attaching events to other things. So you're wiring them in or attaching them. When someone clicks a button, that's an event. So you might want to wire in an event to happen when someone clicks the button. Here's an example. In general, you say the name of the object variable dot on, and then the name of the event, such as click, on double click, etc. And then you set the name of the event handler. Here's an example. We have an event handler named join list. Var join list equals function, and then we call alert inside of there. Okay, well that's all fine and dandy, but right now it's just an anonymous function. It's not an event handler. How do we attach the event handler to the click event of a button? We want to handle the event, but how do we attach it? Well, you get the element by ID submit button, and then you set you dot on click, so that's the name of the event name, or the name of the event, and then you say equals join list. So we're saying I want you to point to that event, and anytime I click that submit button, it should call this function. How do we attach this to the double click event of a text box? So instead of the button, let's say if someone double clicks the text box, we want it to also call the join list function. Well, document.getElementById, and then they pass text box 1 to it. That gets the text box. Then they put on DBL click. So that is the double click event, and we set the event handler as join list. So you should know what an event handler is, what it means to attach an event handler. Triggering an event occurs when, for example, you click a button that triggers the click event. If you double click a text box, that triggers the double click event for the text box. Here's an HTML for a page. You've got please join our list. You've got a label and then input types. You've got text and a button, ID, email address, and join list. And then here's the JavaScript that attaches two event handlers in the onload event handler. Let's actually do this example. So we're going to move this over here, and I'm going to actually open up Aptana. I'm going to create an HTML file here. We're going to call it index.html. Okay, so we've got doc type HTML. Good. HTML. Title is testing JavaScript. All right. Oops, that should be a header. Sorry. Inside the header, I put the title in there. There we go. Good. And now we're going to add a body. So inside the body, we're going to put h1, please join our email list. Okay, we already got the /h1. Then you're going to put label for email address. Email address. Okay. And we have to actually put the input type. So we're putting a text box here. Oops. Need to make sure it's double quotes. Wow, that messed up. Okay. Text. ID equals email address. And name is also email address. This would help if we needed to access in other ways as well. We'll get to that in a later course. We're going to put a space, oops, and NBSSP, backspace. Okay. Input type equals button. ID equals join list. And value is also, or is join our list. And then a break. All right, so there's our HTML. Well, what about the, oh, we also have to include the JavaScript. So, in the head, you could put script type equals text / JavaScript, right? src equals, you actually don't really need the type thing. It's an old habit. But we're going to have one called email, or email join, email_join.js. All right, let's see if that works. I'm going to create a JavaScript file called email join.js. All right, here's our JavaScript file, and we're going to put the appropriate JavaScript. So we're first going to define this anonymous function to save us some time. Return document dot, document, not occupant, document.getElement by ID. Notice the case does matter, so you can't be lazy. You have to make sure it's the E is capitalized, the B is capitalized, and the I is capitalized. Can't just fake it till you make it. Another anonymous function called joinList, and this isn't going to do anything really productive at this point. It's just going to tell us that something's being run. So joinList is being run, giving us an alert. Change value. This one's a function also. It's calling an alert. The change value function is being run. Right? Okay, probably on a period too. Just keep it consistent with what they're doing. And then finally, how do we actually set the handlers? Well, as I said below, or we'll call it attaching event handlers. So how do we attach them? Where's the actual entry point? So window.onload equals function. So this is the event handler for the window onload function. We set it automatically here, and then we set the others manually. So joinList.onClick equals the joinList function we defined. And then we set email address dot on change equals change value. All right, so let's run this, see what happens. We'll have to give it a second. Looks like Firefox is starting up. There we go. Please join our email list and jb@jb.net. When I hit tab, it calls the change value function and says that's being run. When I click join our list, it says the join list function is being run. So we see that these two events are actually wired in here. The event handlers are wired into the events, so they are attached. It's pretty simple. Right? Join list is being run. So that's how that works. It's pretty straightforward. So if we go back here, you'll notice they're just giving you an example of how this actually works. This one, it looks like they're doing using some CSS. There's a miles per gallon application that they've kind of modified from the last time. I'll leave that as an exercise for you. It's on page 111 in the current book. So see if you can make it do this, and also pay very close attention to what's going on with the miles per gallon. How do they actually make that so that the user can't actually modify it? And I'll give you a hint. The word disabled comes to mind. So HTML and JavaScript for the application, they go through here. You get the miles and the gallons. Check to see if they're not a number. If either of them aren't a number, you put both entries must be numeric. And then otherwise you actually calculate it, right? And then set the MPG. When you set the onload, they actually cause the attaching to occur here. All it does is set the calculates on click. So that button calculate is set to calculate MPG, which is the method right here. It's anonymous function right here. So when the user clicks on the calculate button, it will call that function. Then it just sets the focus to miles, so basically it makes sure that it goes back up here. The focus goes to this text box if you wanted to change some things. And then you have the HTML for it. So they put the script inside there instead of a separate, but there's also the email list application. I also encourage you to go through this. It's on page 113 in the current Muroc book. They have the email address, and then if the two email addresses do not match, or they forget the first name, you can actually set it using the spans. We did something similar to this actually a while back on I think the first day, just to show you the examples. But try to get this to work. See if you can get it so that it doesn't have to be red and blue or whatever, unless you want to find the style sheet. I think it's included in the code though for the exercises. So I'll upload those and make sure you have access to it. And then you've got the email for the the HTML, and then the JavaScript for the email list application. So everything you need is pretty much here, except they don't show you the CSS file. So they're going through and validating various values, determining if the values equal a certain amount, and then they set them if not. So notice very carefully what's going on here. Remember what first child node value does? It takes the value in that span, for example, and then it sets it to this entry must equal first entry. So that's exactly what we saw up here. This entry must equal first entry, whereas by default you could just put a space there or put a asterisk, is what I believe they do in the example. There is the exercise 3.2. I don't know if they go through 3.1. They don't go through 3.1. Okay. 3.2. This is another thing I would encourage you to do. It is inside the Exercises Chapter 3 folder. I would encourage you to download that. I believe I've uploaded it. Oops. Let me log back in here. Oops. And okay, live television, folks. And there should be, under the content, week 3. Yep, there's chapter 3 zip file. One thing I want you to all be aware of, this is something you need to know as technical professionals. If you download the zip file, don't go directly into the zip file and start trying to modify things. You have to extract the zip file first. So once you download this, let me give you an example. If I click this and download it, I'll do save as, and then save it to the desktop. Okay. Okay, completed. If I go to my desktop here, I've got the direct file transfer. Let's see if it actually works here. I'm going to do that. Okay, so there's chapter 3 inside there, future value. You have to right click it and go to extract files. Okay, or there could be another option as well. It might be something similar to extract files, depending on what software you have set up. But you have to extract it. You have to unzip it, okay? Or it might say decompress. But then you have the folder. You can get rid of the zip file once you have the folder, and then you can mess with the folder. So you go in there, and in fact, you can actually drag that one out and then get rid of this one. So chapter 3 is really the folder you're interested in. Once you have that out, you can go through and you can load these inside. You can either copy and paste the code from them, or you can open up Tana and do a copy paste, or you should be able to import them as well. You can go to import and then find the different files that you want. So I would recommend that. All right, so 1 and 2, they have extras also, and then like a short at the end. If you're interested in some more activities, I could also provide the code for those. But just practice. Make sure that you are comfortable with calling functions, using event handlers specifically, accessing stuff from the window and document objects, dealing with strings, and dealing with dates. So if you're comfortable with those, you should be all right. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or use the discussion board to talk to your fellow classmates and myself. Otherwise, just send me an email. And also, if you have anything to say or any comments or suggestions, or if you'd like more examples of something else, feel free to email me. I won't look at it and say, oh, that person doesn't know what's going on. I do encourage you to read through and make sure you're solid on whatever the material is. But if you do have questions or something's not clear, feel free to ask me. Do read the book. That is very important, especially the Maroc book. But also I think if you take the time to read the Duckett book, you'll find that it has a lot of very interesting things to say. So anyway, I'll talk to you later. I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.